Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, where we take up the articles from the Hindu and discuss them as per the demands of civil services examination. The topics of the discussion are listed on your screen. Now moving on to the first article of the day that has featured in the Hindu on page 6, basically is a topic of the case study and as mentioned under the GS4 syllabus of our mains, we have to study the ethical case studies. Now the particular article highlights a boundary dispute between the states of Karnataka and that of Maharashtra. Now the people of 40 gram panchayats of the Jat Taluka of Maharashtra want their merger with the Karnataka, basically on the premise that there is a lack of sufficient water and other basic amenities like education, healthcare facilities, power supply, road, etc. Now further they highlight that due to lack of water for irrigation and livestock, people are compelled to migrate from villages. Another issue that this article highlights is the decreasing water table. So people have to go for borewells and for which they take the loans from the local money lenders who charge higher interest rates. And people on the other hand tend to lose their capital as well as land due to the higher interest rate. The case study also highlights that the political leaders are making false promises, which is a major reason for lack of trust. And there are also evidences of violent agitations in the last decade related to the demand which have caused both loss of life as well as property. Through this case study or article, we will try to analyze what are the different issues involved and what are the ethical issues that are involved in this case. There are basically 6 larger issues or the ethical issues that are involved. The first issue here can be mentioned as a breach of social contract. Now in this case, it is evident that the government of Maharashtra has failed miserably in providing the basic amenities to its subjects like water, education and healthcare facilities. And thus there is a clear-cut violation of the social contract theory as given by Thomas Hobbes or John Locke. Further, the second ethical issue that is highlighted through this case study is the issue of politics without principle. The political leaders of Maharashtra are making false promises which is against the Gandhian philosophy of politics with principle. The politics is based on the trust of the people on their leaders. And if the leaders fail to deliver the same promises, then the situation will arise, then there will be a lack of trust and people will lose their trust in the electoral democracy. The third ethical issue that can be highlighted here is the disrespect of the general will. In this case, given the people of Jat Taluka of Maharashtra want to merger of villages with the state of Karnataka, but Maharashtra is denying their demands merely for the political reason. Thus, this is a clear-cut disrespect of the general will as given by the Rousseau. As per the philosophy of Rousseau, will of people is supreme in the democracy. Even Abraham Lincoln also said that democracy is for the people, by the people and of the people, and thus should reflect the will of the people. The fourth ethical issue that can be highlighted from this case study is the issue of business without morality. Now, during our discussion in the beginning, we have seen that people are taking loans for the borewell as the water table has reduced considerably. Moneylenders are providing these loans, but moneylenders charge very high interest rate irrespective of the paying capacity of the co-village borrowers, most of which are poor farmers and have to leave their lands or to commit suicide or move to urban areas. Now this highlights doing business without morality. Another ethical issue that can be pointed out is the issue of violent protest. As it is given that a case that many violent protests have been taking place in the last decade, which might have caused loss of lives as well as property. Now what this highlight is nothing but a lack of virtues like temperance and wisdom at the end of masses and that of leaders. Violent protest cannot be justified for any reasonable demand in the democracy. And at the last, The case study also involves lack of environmental ethics, as it is provided in the case that water table is depleting at a very fast rate due to the issues of over extraction of groundwater. This shows that people and the government are both devoid of environmental ethics or cohabitation or the symbiotic relations that need to be maintained to ensure sustainable development. As a rational human being is liable to protect the environment, but here in this case, people are failing in this regard. Thus, these were the ethical issues that can be traced from the particular case study and can be used to answer case studies on similar lines. Now, let us move to the next article of the day.
This article of the Hindu newspaper appeared on page 14 and talks about the recent approval given by Rajya Sabha for the clearance of Wildlife Protection Bill that seeks to bring certain amendments to the existing Wildlife Protection Act 1972. The act actually tried to regulate the protection of wild animal, birds and plants in India. The original bill was introduced last year, that is 2021, and has tried to brought certain changes to the existing act with respect to the schedules and the powers given to the central government. The bill seeks to increase the number of species protected under the existing law because the law was created in 1972, although many species have been added since then, but now the ambit is going to be larger enough with respect to the international practices. Now, when we talk about the international practices, government is looking into the implementation of the Convention on International Trade in endangered species of wild fauna and flora. This is commonly known as CITES. Now, CITES is an important international institution that is working to protect the international trade on the endangered and protected species. Now, before starting the discussion, let me give you a simple example. Recently, India has seen the relocation of African cheetah that has landed in India Kuno National Park. Now, the transfer of that species from Africa to India is certified through the important provisions of CITES. And these CITES provisions allow the particular species to transfer from one place to the other on the pretext of certain documentation, as well as provision with respect to the permits available for import and export of that particular species. I'll give you another example. Assume that there is a particular species which is very threatened and only 10 or 15 of such individual of that particular species is alive now. Now, if we are looking to conduct the research and development on the protection of that species, we require samples from that species or maybe one species alive. For transfer of that species from their original in situ habitation to the ex situ research and development, we require certain permissions. And these permits for import and export of international threatened species is governed by the provisions of CITES. So what government is looking is that they are going to bring out the most specific provisions of CITES in the existing Wildlife Protection Act, and that is the reason they are looking to change or amend the existing Wildlife Protection Act. Now, from the perspective of prelim examination, it is important for the student to understand the important factual information with respect to CITES as well as the factual information with respect to the Wildlife Protection Act. For your General Studies paper 3 in the mains examination, it is important for the student to have the basic understanding that why these changes were brought in the Act, what are going to be the long-term impact of these provisions and how they are going to impact the center-state relationship with respect to the environment protection. So today, we will start from the CITES first of all. So CITES is an international agreement which is governed in 184 nations. This agreement will ensure that the international trade in the specimens, see, we are not talking about the entire generation of a species, we are just talking about a specimen. Let's say one individual out of 1,000. And the trade in this specimen of wild animals and plants should not be threatened with respect to the trade. So if the international trade is taking place and it is not threatening the existence of that plant or animal, it is good. But if that trade threatens the existence, for example, if China starts exporting the panda that will threaten the existence of panda in China itself. So that kind of trade should be protected, and for this, CITE is the one international institution. This was drafted under the IUCN, which is an international non-governmental organization also known to publish the red list of threatened species. However, the current administration of CITE is under the United Nations Environment Programme. CITES have laid down important provisions which are legally binding. Please understand this. These are legally binding. And that is the reason why India, which is also the signatory to this agreement, is going to bring out the changes in its own domestic law. So as it is legally binding, it is implemented by Indian laws. However, it is not there to replace Indian laws. So till now, Indian government was not forced, because it is not binding with respect to the replacement of the existing law. So what government is doing, it is not replacing the existing Wildlife Protection Act. It is just making it more comprehensive with the inclusion of international standards. So the main function of CITES is that it will protect all import, export, re-export and the introduction of species through the licensing system. See, please understand, CITES does not prohibit completely the transfer of species. If it would have completely prohibited, India would have never got African cheetah. So it actually regulates the transfer of species from one place to the other for logical purposes and not for the commercial trade. For leather industry, for pharmaceutical industry, that kind of purposes are completely avoided by CITES. So each nation is going to designate a particular management authority to control such trade. Now please understand, till now India never had such kind of management authority that will control the trade in flora and fauna. We have National Board of Wildlife, we have Wildlife Crime and Control Bureau, but they are not associated with the protection of international trade. They are mostly looking towards the protecting of the species within the Indian boundaries. And the CITES also provides 3 categorization under 3 appendices, that is 1, 2 and 3, where the convention has listed down various species that requires protection. All these 3 appendices are listed on your screen. So the first appendix says that most critically endangered species are going to be here, which will require absolute prohibition on the commercial trade. But for research purposes, the species can be transferred from one place to the other. For example, there is Asian cheetah. An Asian cheetah naturally is found only in Iran. Now, if Iran wants to export or India wants to import Asian cheetah from Iran, they require certain provisions. But that should only be under research purposes and not for reallocation. The second appendix talks about those species which might get endangered in future. For transferring of those species, we require export permit, export, re-export certificates and also the import permit. In third appendix, there is trade, which is actually allowed. So please understand this, that it is not completely prohibited. Certain species can be traded through the appropriate permits and certificates. Please clarify this, that all world species are not under CITES. For example, if a person wants to take away crow or they want to take away, let's say, sparrow from India to, let's say, Pakistan or from India to Africa, if that sparrow is not in the list of CITES, there is no permit required. There is no prohibition ever imposed. So that will be totally allowed to transport from one nation to the other. However, if it is in under CITES, certain certificates are required. Now let us go through the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. What this law has to say. So we will go for the basic law, then we will look into what government is likely to bring as changes. So Wildlife Protection Act 1972. As Environmental Protection Act finds its place with respect to forest and wildlife under the concurrent list of Indian Constitution, both center and the state can create laws on this. Secondly, this act establishes certain schedules that protects both plants and animals. It also restricts the hunting or the harvesting of these species. So you cannot harvest. Now harvest here simply means that there are certain plant species that you cannot grow in your home garden. You cannot grow opium on your terrace. Alright, so keep that in mind. It also provides for the formation of Wildlife Advisory Board, wildlife wardens, specifies their powers and the duties. And this is the point where government has recently brought some changes. It has created certain organizations under the Act. For example, National Board for Wildlife was created under this law, which is chaired by the Prime Minister of India. Along with this, National Tiger Conservation Authority and even the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau was also created under this law. This law has laid down various wildlife protected areas. So whenever there is a new national park, whenever there is a new wildlife sanctuary, they are created through the provisions identified under this law. It has helped India to become the parties to the CITES. So when CITES came into existence, along with India's Wildlife Protection Act, India easily got entry into these international agreements. And lastly, this act also provides for the licenses that is required to sell, transfer, possession of some wildlife species. So if you have a tiger in your house, you should get it licensed. Now UPSC is very much curious about the different level of protection provided to the wildlife in India. Under the Wildlife Protection Act, there are 6 schedules. And all these 6 schedules talks about the different level of protection to different species. The first schedule is talking about the endangered species, critically endangered species and others. There are harshest penalties which are imposed on the person who is found to be trading or hunting in these species, which is completely prohibited. The second schedule is also talking about the same. There is a high level of protection. However, trade is prohibited and hunting is allowed only if it is threat to human life. So if a lion is threat to human life, although it is under the Wildlife Protection Act, through the protection species, as a protection species, that lion can be killed. Schedule 3 and 4 talks about the protected species. However, they are not completely endangered and the penalty is also very less. The 5th schedule talks about the animals that can be hunted and called as vermins. Many a times you will find in the news that there are certain states which talks about bringing some species under Schedule 5. Bringing a species under Schedule 5 means anyone can kill that particular species. And the last schedule talks about the flora or the plant species which are endemic to India. They are protected and prohibited from cultivation and planting without permission of the government. So now let us understand that what government is trying to bring changes in this law. The first change is that they are going to reduce down the number of schedules from 6 to 4. So they will remove the schedule belonging to the vermin and they will add new schedule that talks about the species of CITES. So as we have seen that there are 3 appendices which are mentioned in CITES. So some of the species mentioned in CITES which are in India also will now be brought as a separate schedule under this law. Then it also seeks to implement certain provisions of CITES which were not implemented previously. For example, there will be a new agency, a new management authority which will be created, which will provide exports and import permit for the trade of certain specimens. I'll come back to this provision where the functions of CITES says that there should be a management authority, as you can see on the screen. So the management authority should be there, which will provide trading permits. India as of now never had that permission. So now the export and import permits will be provided for certain specimen of animal and plant species. However, for this new agency will be created under the bill. Every person who is possessing live specimen of scheduled animal must obtain a registration certificate. So as I said previously, if you have a lion in your house, please get it registered as soon as possible. All the actions which are taken by the chief warden in every protected area will now be accordance with the plan created by the central government. Please understand, every protected area, let's say a national park. So a national park will have chief wildlife warden. Previously, Chief Wildlife Warden had to create a plan with accordance to the natural requirement and the state particularly. But now that plan should also be in align with what central government is saying to the chief warden. The bill empowers even the central government to notify the conservation reserve on its own. So now if central government gets this power, they can easily provide conservation reserve to the union territories which were not possible previously. It also provides that any person who voluntarily surrenders any captive animal. So let's say you are walking by a street and you suddenly find a tiger roaming around. So you can submit or voluntarily surrender the tiger to the government, but please remember you are not going to get any compensation for that. And the last one is any person who is found to be violating this act will now have to pay more money to get released. It simply means that penalty amount has been raised under the new bill. So now it has been passed by the parliament. It will soon go for the assent of the president and will soon be rolled out for the environmental governance. With this discussion in place, let us now move to the next article for the day.
Moving on to the next article of the day that has appeared on the page 10 of the Hindu, basically talks about the issue of remittances in India and highlights the report given by the World Bank, that is Remittances Brave Global Winds report, and highlights that the remittances to India is to touch a record high of $100 billion in the year 2022. Now UPSC under the GS2 paper has mentioned the cases and the policies related to Indian diaspora, and in the previous year, that is in 2017 and also in 2020, has asked questions related to the Indian diaspora. As remittances are directly related to the case of Indian diaspora, under this article we'll try to understand what basically diaspora is. We'll also try to understand in detail the report and the changing trends of the remittances around the world and particularly with regard to India. Further, as a part of our discussion, we will try to understand the significance of diaspora, the challenges faced by the diaspora abroad, and the way forward that has been suggested by the Parliamentary Standing Committee regarding the diaspora problems, such that their meaningful participation can be further observed. Now, the World Bank latest Migration and Developmental Brief, that is titled as Remittances Brave Global Headwinds, highlights that remittances to India are set to touch a record high of $100 billion in the year 2022. In the year 2021, the same remittances that were flown to India were close to $89 billion. And this is the first time that India will touch the mark of $100 billion. Further, the World Bank report also highlights the top 5 recipients of the remittances, where India leads the position at around $100 billion and is followed by countries like Mexico, China, Philippines, and that of Egypt. Now, another interesting thing that this report highlights is the structural shift in the remittance economy of India, both in terms of top destination countries as well as the nature of jobs held. Now, this is very important to understand here. Earlier, the majority of remittances that were flowing to India were from the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, that is the GCC or the Middle Eastern countries of the world. However, the report highlights that remittances have benefited from a gradual structural shift from the countries of Gulf or the Middle Eastern countries and from the jobs that were earlier low skilled informal employment to a high income countries such as US, UK and East Asia. And also there is a change in the kind of job which now requires high skill. The report highlights the pandemic picture, wherein it says that people working from home benefited from the large fiscal stimulus which was given, the wage hikes that are also being seen in the post-pandemic phase. And all these factors have contributed towards India's remittances touching a record high of $100 billion for 2022. Now, the report also at the same time highlights that from 2016 to 2021, while the remittances from the US, UK and the East Asian countries like Singapore, Japan, Australia and New Zealand, basically the developed countries, have increased considerably. And their share have risen from 26 to 36% as a part of remittances. And the share of Gulf cooperation countries that were 54% has steadily declined to a level of 28%. What this highlights is the fact that now Indians or the remittances that are received by India from abroad is from developed countries and also secondly from more formal source of employment which are highly skilled in their nature. The report also gives the future of remittances, what will be the remittances future not only for the global level but also for the South Asia and India also. The report predicts that the growth in remittances will fall to 2% in 2023. And this is due to GDP growth in high income countries continues to slow down. For South Asia also, the report highlights the growth of remittances is expected to fall from 3.5% in 2022 to just 0.7% in 2023. While India is an exception to this case. As per the World Bank highlight or the forecast, the Indian remittances are forecasted to grow by 4% next year. If we see the case of South Asia, the remittances forecast is negative, but for India it is expected to grow at a 4%, thus being an exception to the case of South Asia. And this is supported by the large share of Indian migrants that are earning relatively higher salaries in the US, UK and East Asia. Now that we have seen our discussion on the report that was given by World Bank, we should try to understand the issue of diaspora. As the remittances primarily are related to diaspora, first we'll try to understand what basically diaspora is. Now, Indian diaspora refers to people whose origin can be traced to India or are Indian citizens living abroad. This includes non-resident Indians or the NRIs which is used in common parlance, persons of Indian origin and also includes overseas citizen of India. Now if we see the role of diaspora is very significant and can play an important role in ensuring the economic development of their countries of origin. Not only are the diaspora well-known source for remittances, they can also promote trade, FDI, give a boost to business and can be helpful in shaping the foreign policy as well as can also contribute in transfer knowledge and skill. During our discussion now, we'll try to understand the significance of diaspora. Now the significance of diaspora can be attributed to their economic contribution. Now diaspora influences national economies in several ways. We have seen that diaspora contributes to remittances, which India is to achieve a mark of $100 billion. These remittances are primarily made to family members. Now the remittances transfer is either monetary or in kind, and it is done from a migrant to his or her home country. This is perhaps the most visible economic implications of or the significance of a diaspora, and most of the remittances are primarily sent from developed countries to low and middle income countries. Remittances have further benefits also. Now, remittances can also act as form of private social protection that can supplement or even substitute public social protection. Now, the reports highlight that the increased remittances tend to reduce the public social protection expenditure. The second contribution that the diaspora can make here is not only related to the households but also has certain spillover effects and benefits the wider community. And this is observed through various reports where it was highlighted that the consumption as well as the community development projects have increased. The next economic contribution that the diaspora can make is of brain gain. Now a thing associated with the migrants or the diaspora is that they have moved to the foreign countries for better opportunity and which in turn leads to brain drain. But if we see the case of India, we can also understand that brain gain has also happened at the same time. Now we'll try to understand how this brain gain happens. Now the brain gain occurs when migrants learn skills or obtain education abroad and then transfer their knowledge and skills back to the homeland, either through their networks within the country or by returning to their native homestay. Through knowledge transfer, The sending countries gain from skilled immigration as skilled migrants accumulate the intellectual as well as the economic capital, while the host country can be strategically utilized by the home country to mitigate the brain drain effect. Now, if we see the example, the development of Indian IT sector is an example of brain gain effect in the action. The diaspora was instrumental in bringing the skills, human and social capital, and networks that were needed to grow the sector in the home country. And this example of Indian IT sector booming is demonstrative of how diaspora can act as agent of development through the brain gain effect. The next economic contribution that diaspora can make is through international trade and investment. Now, international trade and investment also happens, and the studies have shown that the size of diaspora population has a significant and positive correlation with the international trade between the host nation and the diasporic homeland. The model indicates that the size of a diaspora in a trade partner is positively correlated with the facilitation of trade with the country of origin. And the findings show Indian diaspora has been instrumental in promoting trade linkages between India and other regions in the Asia Pacific region. Secondly, diaspora also contributes in the economic aspect by promoting FDI. The FDI from diaspora is strongly influenced by the diaspora affinity for their culture in their homeland. Now, reports and various studies done by scholars have highlighted that diaspora, which is having high cultural affinity towards their homeland or a perception of being close to the homeland, have contributed positively towards the development of their homeland. So this was the economic significance of the diaspora. Now we will try to understand what has been the political significance of diaspora. Now the policies that the countries make can often be shaped by diaspora, as the policies which a country shapes affects the issue of diaspora, and diaspora groups can also have a significant effect on policies. Now diaspora often mobilizes networks and resources to support certain cause in either of their homeland or the host countries. Now diaspora has grown significantly in the recent times, and with the increasing globalization, it has been driven in the significant part of policy changes. The studies have also shown that there is evidence of preferential trade agreements that is stimulating significantly from increased migration and strong diaspora communities acting as a bridge between the homeland and the host countries, which has finally culminated to the signing of various preferential trade agreement with each other. So the increased migration has led to increased trade as well as increased number of preferential trade agreements as well as free trade agreements. The political clout is also highlighted by the fact that leaders of Indian origin such as Kamala Harris of United States of America and recently Rishi Sunak as the PM of UK highlights the growing clout of the Indian diaspora over the world. An example of which from the past can be taken from the Indo-US nuclear deal, where the growing political clout of Indians in America contributed to the final culmination of deal between India and United States, or what we today know as the nuclear deal or the 1-2-3 agreement between India and United States of America. Another significance of diaspora is the contribution to the foreign policy development. Now in the recent times in India, there has been institutionalization of the diaspora diplomacy. Now this institutionalization of diaspora diplomacy is indicative of the prominence of the role played by the diaspora in foreign policy formulation, which is now acting as an instrument of soft power and thus meeting the ends or the limitation of hard power. A country like India has limited hard power capabilities, and thus India is utilizing its diaspora community as a form of diaspora diplomacy to achieve its goal through soft power media. Despite of the tremendous contribution of diaspora in the economic, political and the foreign policy field, the Indian diaspora in particular faces several key challenges, and these were also highlighted by the reports which was made by the Parliamentary Standing Committee. We'll try to understand what are the various challenges that the Indian diaspora currently faces. The first challenge that the Indian diaspora is regarded with policy. The committee observed that there is no clear policy on diaspora in place despite of their social economic contributions to the development of the country. Further, the report also highlighted that the External Affairs Ministry even lacks the basic database. The Ministry of External Affairs have not updated data on Indian diaspora as registration with Indian embassies is voluntary. In the absence of database, welfare schemes cannot be implemented properly. Another issue that was highlighted by the Parliamentary Standing Committee report was regarding with the Immigration Management Bill. Now, it highlighted that the bill has been in the consultation and vetting stage from a long time. The bill, which seeks to establish an immigration framework and liberalize clearances and strengthen the welfare for overseas migrants, is still in the discussion stages. Further, the committee also tried to highlight that there have been issue of multiple portals that are overlapping each other for grievance redressal purposes. For example, portals like eMigrate, CP Grams are in place to resolve the grievances of Indian nationals abroad. The committee highlighted that the multiple portals have delayed grievance resolution and recommended that ministry should avoid duplication of work. The committee also submitted a report where it highlighted the issue of COVID pandemic and its effect on the Indian diaspora. The committee highlighted that during COVID-19, many workers including Gulf returnees have lost their job. As the pandemic eased, few workers have returned to their place of employment. But the committee also found out that the rehabilitation scheme to ensure the livelihood security for the workers who have lost their jobs or were unable to return to their place of employment is required. The committee highlighted that there is a need for skilling of potential migrant workers. Committee noted that the international labor market has now become demand driven and is more competitive when compared with the previous times. With new labor markets that are emerging in the East African countries such as Japan, Korea, Taiwan, there is a need to focus on the skilling aspect of the migrants, and which currently is a challenge. Another area which was highlighted by the community was the issue of students in Ukraine and China. As soon as the Russia-Ukraine war started, or with the pandemic hitting the China, several Indian medical students studying in Ukraine and China were unable to resume their courses physically or even complete their internship. This has impacted their future. The committee also took note of the issues pertaining to the NRI marriages. There have been increasing cases of women who are being deserted by the NRI marriages. And for this, the registration of marriage of non-resident Indian Bill 2019 was examined by the committee, and the report for the same was also presented. The committee highlights the need for setting up the one-stop center. It highlighted that though the ministry had decided to establish overseas centers to help distressed NRI women, such a center remains elusive today. That is, the center is only on the paper. Further, there are also other threats related to diaspora which are region specific. For example, in the case of West Asia, one of the most direct threats to the security of Indians is rising conflicts and the instability due to the Shia-Sunni conflict that is prevalent, and also with the spread of radical Islam in that. The committee also highlighted that the regressive in medieval policies like employers seizing the travel documents upon arrival, which is known as the kafala labor system, are exploitative for Indian migrants who are working abroad. For the case of developed countries like US, UK, it highlighted that the discriminative practices owing to the racist and colonial mindsets, still persist, and even the cultural integration thus becomes difficult and thus challenges the issue of diaspora that is working abroad. So, now that we have seen what are the various challenges that have been faced by the diaspora of India, as highlighted by the Parliamentary Standing Committee, we have to understand what can be the way forward while dealing with the problems of the diaspora, such that the meaningful and important contribution of the diaspora can be retained. The first way forward, the committee recommended that is a need for a clear policy document on diaspora, which would serve as a guiding principle for the engagement with the community. The committee also recommended that Indian embassies should encourage the diaspora to register themselves. As we have seen in our discussion, that the registration is voluntary. Thus, there is a need for Indian embassies to encourage. For the immigration bill, the committee has recommended for the introduction of the bill at the earliest. We have also seen that there was duplication of various portals for the diaspora miseries, and the committee has noted that the CP Grants portal is the quickest way to interact with the state government or district police. But it is not popular overseas, and hence the committee has recommended to publicize the portal so it can be used to resolve grievances effectively. Further, it also recommended that a comprehensive rehabilitation scheme should be there in coordination with ministries, department and the state governments. As we have also seen that now the world is moving towards demand-driven labor market, it has recommended improving the quality of domestic skilling and standardizing the curriculum across the country to ensure that migrant workers are able to go abroad and secure a meaningful employment with better wages for themselves. For the case of Indian students whose degrees had been stuck, particularly with regard to the Ukraine and China, the committee had recommended ministry to ensure Indian private medical institution enroll returnee students from Ukraine. The committee also recommended the ministry to enact a law for the benefit of NRI women so that the destitution of the NRI wives should stop. The one-stop center scheme, which was envisaged by the Ministry of External Affairs, should be launched without a delay. Apart from this, there is a need for the government to consider setting up of special economic zones exclusively for the projects to be set up by the NRIs and the people of Indian origin to boost development and trade. It also recommended that government should consider issuing special infrastructure bonds for attracting NRI and people of Indian origin investment on the lines of Israel bonds. And at the last, it has also recommended setting up of standard labor export agreement. Now we have seen that there is issue like kafala system in the West Asian countries. Thus, there is a need for standard labor and export agreement with the host countries, and monitoring and supervision of our overseas workers by our mission is recommended. It also recommends compulsory insurance schemes covering the risk faced by the overseas workers abroad. With this, we have seen what actually diaspora is, what is the significance of the diaspora. We have also understood what are the various challenges that the diaspora is facing as regard with the Parliamentary Standing Committee and the issues faced with particular countries or the regions. And at the last, we have also seen the way forward to counter these problems. Now moving on to the next article of the day, basically talks about the process to appoint ad hoc judges to be made less cumbersome as observed by the Supreme Court Justice Sanjay Kishan Kaul. Now UPSC under the GS2 syllabus has provided for the judiciary, its organization and functioning. Now the article is in news because the successful senior lawyers are not generally interested in giving up their lucrative legal practice to become the judges of High Court. Justice Sanjay Kishan Kaul also highlighted that increasing pendency of cases is also a major concern, and as an alternative, he suggested that such lawyers can be offered judgeship for ad hoc basis or for a limited period of time under the Article 224A. Now, in our discussion, we will try to understand the appointment of additional, acting and ad hoc judges in the High Court. That is under Article 224 and under Article 224A. Further, we will also try to understand the appointment procedure of ad hoc judges and retired judges at the Supreme Court level. And at the same time, we'll also try to understand what are the basic trigger points to use Article 224A for judicial appointment as understood by the Supreme Court. And at last, we'll try to understand the recent recommendations that have been made. Now, the first thing to understand here is the appointment of additional and the acting judges or the ad hoc judges at the High Court. Now, appointment of judges to the High Court under 224 or 224A is done by President. Now, the Article 224 talks about the case of additional and acting judges. It says the appointment of additional judges is to be done by the President under Article 224 Clause 1. And the reason given for the appointment of such additional judges to the High Court is to deal with the increasing areas of work in the High Court. That is to avoid pendency and decrease the workload on the existing judges. Now, the appointment of the acting judges is also done by the President as we have previously discussed. And the reason for the appointment of acting judge is not different. The reason of appointment of active judge happens is that the permanent judge of High Court other than the Chief Justice is unable to perform his duty. And once an acting judge is so appointed, he remains in the office for not less than 3 months unless there is any special reason for doing so. For both additional as well as acting judges, they have to be duly qualified to be appointed as a judge of a High Court, meaning thereby by the qualification that he must be a citizen of India, and secondly, he must have been holding a judicial office for at least 10 years or a practicing advocate in a High Court for at least 10 years. There is no minimum age limit that has been prescribed for the judge. And unlike the provisions for the Supreme Court, where there is a provision for distinct jurists to be appointed as a Supreme Court judge, there is no clause for the distinct jurist in the case of qualifications for a High Court judge. Further, the retirement of additional as well as acting judges is same as that of other High Court judges at 62 years. Now we'll try to understand the case of ad hoc judges as provided under Article 224A. Article 224A talks about the ad hoc judges, and it says that appointment of retired judges at sittings of High Courts by the President. The criteria only is that the person should have been retired from a High Court. He is entitled to such allowance as the President may determine. And he will have the jurisdiction, power and privileges of the High Court, but shall not be deemed to be a judge of High Court. Further, any appointments that is made under the Article 224 Clause A does not constrain the regular appointment process in the High Court, and at the same time, the ad hoc judges will receive the same emoluments and the allowances as paid to the permanent or the additional judges of the High Court concerned. The emoluments of the ad hoc judges will also be charged on the Consolidated Fund of India. A thing to understand here is that, which can be asked in prelims also, that constitutional is silent on the tenure of ad hoc judges and the number of judges to be appointed. That is, Article 224A does not mention the tenure of an ad hoc judges that is appointed and about the number of judges that is to be appointed. And this can be framed as a question in your prelims examination. Now, we'll try to understand the process of appointment of ad hoc judges and retired judges at the Supreme Court as they can also be asked as a comparison in the prelims examination. Now, the appointment of ad hoc judges as well as the retired judges at the Supreme Court level happens through Article 127. It happens generally when there is a lack of quorum of judges in the Supreme Court. Now, the Chief Justice of India, with the previous consent of the President, after consultation with the Chief Justice of the High Court, consider a person who is fit to be appointed or is duly qualified for the appointment as a judge of Supreme Court to attend the sittings of the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice of the High Court will communicate his consent for the release of particular judge after consulting with the Chief Minister of the state in which the High Court is situated. Now, once a judge is appointed as an ad hoc judge under Article 127, he shall have all the jurisdiction, powers, privileges, and discharge the duties as a judge of the Supreme Court concerned. And he is also entitled for the allowances as the President may by order determine. He should be treated for jurisdiction, power and privileges of other Supreme Court judge, but shall not otherwise be deemed to be a judge of Supreme Court. Now this brings to a question that what was the Supreme Court observation regarding the ad hoc judges of the High Court under Article 224A. The 5 trigger points to use Article 224A for judicial appointment as observed by the Supreme Court are if the vacancies are more than 20% of the sanction strength, if there is a case that particular category of cases are pending for over 5 years at a time, the 10% of the backlog of the pending cases is more than 5 years old, the percentage of the rate of disposal is lower than the institution of the cases, and a situation of mounting error is likely to arise if the rate of disposal is constantly lower than the rate of filing over a period of a year or more. Thus, the vacancies, pendency, areas, and the rate of disposal primarily determines the trigger points for appointment of ad hoc judges under Article 224A as per the observations made by the Supreme Court. Now this brings us to the last part of our discussion, that what are the new suggestions that have been given. Now the court was hearing a case which was filed by NGO Lok Prahari seeking invocation of Article 224A for appointment of ad hoc judges in the High Court. Under this, Justice Sanjay Kishan Kaul said senior advocates in the High Courts may not be willing to give up their lucrative practices, as we have already discussed in the introductory part, and asked for ad hoc judges to be appointed under Article 224A for a limited period of about 2 years. The bench also observed that process should not be cumbersome or complex, and the whole purpose for which of ad hoc appointment is made should not be lost. The court also pointed out that the retired judges who are willing to come back to the bench as ad hoc judges bring their experience and expertise in dealing with the areas. However, the process of appointment must not linger on, and the government must cooperate in clearing the such backlogs. And this has been the recommendation that have been made in the recent case, wherein the retired judges can be invited who have the expertise in handling the areas and the backlog, and the ad hoc basis of judgeship can be offered keeping in mind the pendency of cases at the High Court level.